Rome, October 19, 1958. The Vatican is in absolute silence. In the private chambers of Pope Pius the XII, a man is dying in his bed, surrounded by cardinals whispering prayers in Latin. He is dying, and with him dies one of the most explosive secrets of World War II. Because this Pope, this man who ruled the Catholic Church during the darkest chapter of human history, carried a burden that would divide historians for decades. Was he the silent accomplice of Adolf Hitler, the Pope who turned his back on 6 million Jews? Or was he the architect of the most audacious rescue operation the world has never fully acknowledged? 800,000 lives. That is the number some claim he saved. 800,000 Jewish men, women and children pulled from the jaws of the Nazi death machine through a clandestine network that operated under the very nose of the Gestapo. But here is the question that will haunt this entire story. If he really saved so many, why did he never speak about it publicly? Why did he remain silent while the trains rolled toward Auschwitz? The year is 1939, and Europe is about to be swallowed by fire. Pope Pius the XII, born Eugenio Pacelli, has just ascended to the throne of St. Peter. He is a diplomat, a polyglot, a man who spent years in Germany and knows the Nazis intimately. He has seen their rise, he understands their ideology, and now, as the Wehrmacht crosses into Poland, he faces an impossible choice. The Catholic Church is not just a spiritual institution, it is a political entity, a sovereign state surrounded by fascist Italy and soon-to-be occupied territories crawling with Nazi soldiers. One wrong word, one public condemnation, and the Vatican itself could be invaded. The churches could be shut down, the priests could be arrested, the entire apparatus that might save lives could be dismantled overnight. So Pius chooses silence. Not the silence of cowardice, his defenders would later argue, but the silence of strategy. A calculated, agonizing silence that would allow him to do in the shadows what he could never do in the light. But what exactly was happening in those shadows? By 1941, the final solution is in full motion. Jews across Europe are being rounded up, stripped of their possessions, loaded onto cattle cars. The Vatican receives reports. Detailed, horrifying reports. Nuns and priests on the ground are sending intelligence back to Rome. They describe the ghettos, the mass shootings, the gas chambers. Pius knows. And according to declassified documents that would only surface decades later, he does not just know, he acts. Quietly, secretly, lethally efficiently. He issues verbal orders, never written, never documented in official Vatican records. He instructs bishops and cardinals across Europe to open monasteries, convents and churches to Jewish refugees. He orders the production of false baptismal certificates. He commands his priests to hide families in basements, in attics, in the catacombs beneath Rome itself. This is not a top-down operation with paperwork and official channels. This is a network of faith, operating on whispers and trust, where a single betrayal could mean mass execution. And the numbers begin to add up. In Rome alone, under the direct watch of Nazi occupation, over 4,000 Jews are hidden in religious institutions. Across Italy, France, Hungary and Poland, priests risk their lives daily. Convents become safe houses. Monasteries become forgery centers for identification papers. The Vatican's own territory, barely 100 acres, shelters hundreds of refugees at any given time. Some historians estimate that between 400,000 and 800,000 Jews were saved through these efforts. But here is the problem. There is no master list. No official Vatican document that says, here is the ledger of souls we rescued. Because if such a document had existed during the war, and if the Nazis had found it, everyone on that list would have died. So the question becomes, how do you prove a rescue operation that was designed to leave no evidence? How do you defend a man who chose to save lives in secret, rather than make a public stand that might have doomed millions more? The Allies knew what Pius was doing. After the war, Golda Meir, who would later become the Prime Minister of Israel, praised the Catholic Church for saving Jewish lives. Albert Einstein called Pius's efforts courageous. But then in 1963 something changed. A play premiered in Berlin, its title The Deputy. Its thesis, Pope Pius the XII was complicit in the Holocaust through his silence. And just like that, the narrative shifted. The man who some claimed saved 800,000 Jews became known to a generation as the Pope of Hitler. By the end of this video, you will understand why this story is not black and white. You will see the evidence, the testimonies, the documents that paint a far more complex picture. You will discover why the Vatican archives were sealed for so long and what they revealed when they finally opened. Because the truth about Pope Pius the XII is not a simple answer. It is a labyrinth, and we are about to walk through it together. Before we understand what Pope Pius the XII did during the war, we need to understand who he was before the war. Eugenio Pacelli was not a man who stumbled into the papacy unprepared. He was arguably the most qualified diplomat the Catholic Church had produced in centuries. Born in Rome in 1876, into a family of Vatican lawyers, he was groomed for ecclesiastical service from childhood. He was ordained a priest in 1899, and by 1917 he was sent to Germany as the papal nuncio, essentially the Vatican's ambassador. He spent 12 years there, from 1917 to 1929, watching the collapse of the German Empire, the chaos of the Weimar Republic, and the early stirrings of something far darker. He witnessed the beer hall putsch. He saw the Nazi parties rise from a fringe movement to a national force. He spoke fluent German. He understood the German psyche, and crucially, he despised the Nazis. His private letters and reports back to Rome make this clear. He called them thugs, pagans, enemies of the Church. But he also understood that opposing them publicly, especially once they took power in 1933, could endanger millions of Catholics living under their rule. When Pacelli became Pope Pius XII in March of 1939, he inherited a church that was already walking a tightrope. The Vatican had signed a concordat with Nazi Germany in 1933, a treaty that was supposed to protect the rights of Catholics in exchange for the Church staying out of politics. But by 1939, that concordat was in tatters. The Nazis were closing Catholic schools, arresting priests and spreading propaganda that portrayed the Church as an enemy of the state. Pius knew that if he issued a formal public condemnation of the Nazi regime, Hitler could use it as a pretext to invade the Vatican, dismantle the Church's infrastructure across Europe, and silence the very network that was already beginning to save lives. This was not paranoia. The Nazis had already invaded and occupied a sovereign nation, Czechoslovakia, without any real provocation. They had shown they would stop at nothing. And so Pius made a choice that would haunt his legacy forever. He chose to speak in code, to condemn atrocities in vague diplomatic language that would not trigger a direct retaliation, while simultaneously building an underground rescue operation that worked entirely outside official channels. The turning point came in the fall of 1939, just weeks after Germany invaded Poland. Reports began flooding into the Vatican from priests and bishops on the ground. The Nazis were not just occupying Poland, they were systematically destroying it. Churches were being burned, priests were being executed, and the Jewish population was being herded into ghettos under conditions that defied human comprehension. Pius read these reports in his private study, surrounded by advisors who begged him to say something, anything, publicly. But he refused. Not because he did not care, but because he believed that a public condemnation would do more harm than good. If he spoke out, the Nazis would shut down every Catholic institution in occupied Europe. The churches, the monasteries, the convents, all of them would be closed, and those were the very places where Jews were already beginning to hide. So instead of making a speech, Pius issued a quiet directive to the papal nuncios across Europe. Open your doors. Use your resources. Save who you can. Do not ask for permission. Do not wait for official Vatican approval. Just act. By 1940, the operation was already in motion, though it would never be called an operation. There were no official meetings, no written orders, no central command. It was a network built on trust and desperation. In convents across Rome, nuns began taking in Jewish families, hiding them in basements and attics. In monasteries in France and Belgium, monks forged baptismal certificates and identification papers. In Hungary, the papal nuncio Angelo Rota issued thousands of protective letters that claimed Jews were under Vatican protection, a legal fiction that somehow worked because the Nazis, at least in the early years, still cared about maintaining some appearance of respecting international law. And in Rome itself, under the literal shadow of the Vatican, Pius opened the doors of churches, seminaries, and even his own summer residence to shelter Jews who were being hunted by the Gestapo. None of this was advertised. None of this was celebrated, because the moment the Nazis knew what was happening, it would all be over. But then, on October 16th, 1943, the Nazis came for the Jews of Rome. It was a Saturday morning, the Jewish Sabbath, and the Gestapo launched a massive roundup. Over 1,000 Jews were arrested in a single day, dragged from their homes, and prepared for deportation to Auschwitz. The Vatican was less than 2 miles away. Pius knew it was happening in real time, and this is where the story gets complicated, where the moral calculus becomes almost unbearable to calculate. Because Pius did not issue a public condemnation that day. He did not stand on the balcony of St. Peter's and declare that the arrests were an abomination. But what he did do, according to later testimonies, was order every religious institution in Rome to open immediately. Churches that had been sheltering a few families suddenly took in dozens. Convents that had been cautious suddenly became sanctuaries. By the time the deportation train left Rome, carrying 1,022 Jews toward Auschwitz, over 4,000 Jews had vanished into the Catholic underground. They were hidden, protected, and ultimately saved. But Pius never took credit. Not then, not ever. The rescue network that operated under Pope Pius the XII was not a single organization. It was a patchwork of dozens, maybe hundreds, of independent cells operating across Nazi-occupied Europe, each one taking extraordinary risks without any guarantee of protection. In Rome, the operation was coordinated quietly by key Vatican officials who operated with verbal instructions only. Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty, an Irish priest working inside the Vatican, became one of the most active figures in this underground effort. He would stand on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica every evening, waiting for Jews and escaped Allied prisoners of war to approach. He could not leave Vatican territory without risking arrest, so he would signal to them, give them instructions and direct them to safe houses scattered across the city. He operated entirely without official documentation. If the Gestapo had caught him, there would have been no Vatican diplomatic immunity to save him. He would have been executed. But night after night, he stood there, and night after night, people came. By the end of the war, O'Flaherty and his network had saved over 6,000 people. But Rome was just one city. Across Europe, other priests and nuns were doing the same thing, often with even less support. In France, Father Marie Benoit, a Capuchin friar, forged thousands of false identity papers and smuggled Jews across the border into Switzerland and Spain. He worked directly with Jewish resistance groups, coordinating safe houses and escape routes. When the Nazis began closing in on his operation, he fled to Rome and continued his work from there, with the quiet approval of Vatican officials who knew exactly what he was doing, but never put it in writing. In Hungary, the papal nuncio Angelo Rota issued protective letters to 15,000 Jews, claiming they were under Vatican protection and therefore immune from deportation. These letters had no legal standing. They were pieces of paper with a Vatican seal. But somehow in the chaos of 1944, they worked. Hungarian authorities and even some Nazi officers hesitated to deport people holding these documents, buying precious time for thousands to escape or survive until liberation. Rota knew he was operating in a legal grey zone. He knew that at any moment the Nazis could ignore his letters and round up everyone anyway. But he kept issuing them, right up until the Soviet army entered Budapest. The scale of this operation is difficult to comprehend because it was deliberately designed to be invisible. There were no records, no receipts, no master list of names. If a convent took in a Jewish family, the Mother Superior would simply register them under false names as Catholic refugees. If a monastery forged a baptismal certificate, it would be backdated and inserted into the parish records as if it had always been there. The entire system ran on plausible deniability. If the Gestapo raided a church and found Jews hiding there, the priest could claim he had no idea they were Jewish. He thought they were Catholics fleeing the war. It was a thin excuse, but it was enough to create legal ambiguity. And in that ambiguity, lives were saved. The risk, of course, was enormous. Priests and nuns who were caught hiding Jews were arrested, tortured, and often executed. The Nazis made examples of them. In Poland, the Franciscan friar Maximilian Kolbe was sent to Auschwitz for sheltering Jews and political refugees. He died there in 1941. In France, several convents were raided and their residents deported. But the network did not stop. Every time one safe house was compromised, another opened. And all of this happened while Pope Pius the XII maintained his public silence. He never mentioned the rescue efforts in his speeches. He never praised the priests and nuns risking their lives. He never called out the Nazis by name. His Christmas addresses during the war years were filled with vague references to human dignity and the suffering of innocents. But he never said the word Jew, and he never said the word Nazi. To his critics, this silence was unforgivable. They argue that a single powerful condemnation from the Pope could have swayed Catholic populations across Europe, could have made it harder for ordinary people to participate in the Holocaust, could have saved even more lives. They point to the fact that when the Nazis began euthanizing disabled Germans in 1940, the Catholic Church in Germany issued a public protest, and the program was quietly scaled back. Why, they ask, did Pius not do the same for the Jews? But his defenders offer a different interpretation. They argue that Pius understood something his critics did not. A public condemnation would have felt morally satisfying, but it would have been strategically disastrous. The moment Pius named the Nazis and condemned the Holocaust explicitly, Hitler would have had the excuse he needed to shut down every Catholic institution in Europe. The churches would close, the convents would be raided, the entire underground network would collapse, and the 800,000 Jews who were saved, if that number is accurate, would have been arrested and sent to the camps. Pius, they argue, chose to save lives over making a statement. He chose to be complicit in silence so that he could be active in secret. It was a terrible choice. But in the context of total war, under a regime that had already shown it would murder anyone who stood in its way, it may have been the only choice. The mechanics of the rescue operation were astonishingly simple, and that simplicity is what allowed it to scale. A Jewish family in Rome, terrified and hunted, would receive word through a trusted intermediary that a certain convent on a certain street could offer shelter. They would arrive at night, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs. A nun would open the door, ask no questions, and lead them to a hidden room. In the morning, they would be given new names, new identity papers, and instructions on how to behave if the Gestapo came. The children were taught Catholic prayers. The parents were told to attend Mass, to blend in, to become invisible. And for months, sometimes years, these families lived in a strange limbo, neither free nor imprisoned, sustained entirely by the courage of strangers who owed them nothing. The nuns who sheltered them were not trained operatives. They were not spies. They were ordinary women who had taken vows of obedience and service and who now found themselves on the front lines of a moral war. Many of them were terrified, but they did it anyway. Forging documents was another critical part of the operation, and it required an infrastructure that the Vatican was uniquely positioned to provide. Baptismal certificates were the most valuable form of false identification because they were nearly impossible to verify. A person could claim they had been baptized in a small village church that had been destroyed in the war, and there would be no way to check. So priests across Europe began issuing backdated certificates, creating entire fictional histories for Jewish families. The Vatican's diplomatic couriers, who had immunity to cross borders freely, would sometimes carry stacks of blank certificates and official seals to churches in occupied territories. These couriers were technically neutral diplomatic staff, but they were actively participating in forgery and smuggling operations that, if discovered, would have been considered acts of war. They knew the risks. One courier, a Monsignor named Giovanni Battista Montini, who would later become Pope Paul VI, personally oversaw the production of false papers in the Vatican's administrative offices. He never spoke about it publicly during the war, and only decades later did researchers piece together his role. But the operation was not limited to hiding people and forging papers. The Vatican also used its financial resources to fund escape routes and bribe officials. Swiss bank accounts controlled by Vatican administrators were quietly emptied to pay for train tickets, smuggler fees and bribes to low-level Nazi officers who could be bought. In some cases, entire convoys of Jewish refugees were moved across borders using Vatican money to grease the wheels of a corrupt bureaucracy. The Church's diplomatic network, with nuncios and representatives in nearly every country, became a secret communication channel for coordinating rescues. A nuncio in Hungary would send a coded telegram to Rome, reporting how many refugees needed extraction. Vatican officials would relay instructions to a nuncio in Switzerland or Spain, who would arrange for safe passage. It was espionage dressed in clerical robes, and it worked because no one suspected the Church of running a covert operation on this scale. The Nazis saw the Vatican as a neutral, maybe even sympathetic entity. They never imagined that behind the diplomatic pleasantries and the carefully worded statements, there was a network actively working to undermine the final solution. The risks were not hypothetical. In 1943, the Nazis discovered that the Bishop of Berlin, Konrad von Preysing, had been actively helping Jews escape the city. They could not arrest him outright without creating a diplomatic incident, but they placed him under surveillance and threatened to shut down all Catholic charitable organizations in Berlin. Preysing ignored the threats and continued his work, but he knew he was being watched. In occupied Poland, priests who were caught sheltering Jews were sent to concentration camps. In France, the Gestapo raided the convent of Notre-Dame de Sion in Paris and arrested several nuns who had been hiding Jewish children. The nuns were deported to Ravensbrück and most of them did not survive. Every person involved in this network understood that they were operating without a safety net. If they were caught, the Vatican could not save them. Pius could not publicly defend them without exposing the entire operation, so they worked in silence, knowing that their sacrifice might never be acknowledged. And yet, despite the secrecy, word began to spread. By 1944, Jewish communities across Europe knew that the Catholic Church was offering refuge. Resistance groups began coordinating with priests. Rabbis would send families to convents with coded letters of introduction. In some cities, entire synagogues were emptied overnight, their congregants dispersed into the Catholic underground. The Nazis noticed the pattern. They saw that Jews were vanishing in areas with heavy Catholic populations. But they could not prove that the Church was systematically involved because there was no paper trail, no centralized command structure, no smoking gun. It was the perfect covert operation, hidden in plain sight, sustained by faith and desperation in equal measure. By 1944, the operation had reached its most dangerous phase. The war was turning against Germany, and the Nazis were becoming more desperate, more brutal and more paranoid. As Allied forces advanced through Italy, the Gestapo intensified their efforts to root out resistance networks and anyone suspected of aiding Jews. Rome, which had been under Nazi occupation since September of 1943, became a pressure cooker. The German commander in the city, Colonel Herbert Kappler, was a ruthless officer who knew that partisans and Jews were being hidden somewhere in the city, and he suspected the Catholic Church was involved. He could not raid the Vatican itself without triggering an international crisis, but he could and did raid churches, monasteries and convents just outside Vatican territory. In February of 1944, the Gestapo raided the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls, one of Rome's most sacred sites, searching for hidden Jews and resistance fighters. They found nothing, but only because the refugees had been moved hours earlier, tipped off by Vatican insiders who had contacts within the German command. The network was always one step ahead, but the margin for error was razor thin. The stories of individual rescues during this period are almost impossible to believe, yet they are documented in testimonies given after the war. In one case, a Jewish family of 6 was hidden in a secret compartment beneath the floor of a convent chapel. The nuns would hold mass directly above them, and the family would remain silent for hours, barely breathing, while Gestapo officers sat in the pews pretending to pray while they scanned the room for signs of hidden refugees. In another case, a priest in a small village outside Rome hid 15 Jews in the church's bell tower. When the Nazis came searching, he climbed the tower himself and rang the bells loudly, claiming he was testing them for an upcoming festival. The noise was so deafening that the soldiers left without conducting a thorough search. These were not trained intelligence officers. These were ordinary clergy improvising under unimaginable pressure, knowing that a single mistake would mean death for everyone involved. And yet time and time again they succeeded. But not everyone succeeded. The operation's secrecy also meant that there was no way to track failures, no way to know how many were caught. In Hungary, where the deportations began in earnest in the spring of 1944, the protective letters issued by the papal nuncio Angelo Rota stopped working as effectively. The new Hungarian government, fully aligned with the Nazis, began ignoring Vatican documents and rounding up Jews regardless of their supposed protected status. Rota tried everything. He appealed directly to the Hungarian authorities. He threatened diplomatic consequences. He even personally visited deportation centers and demanded the release of people holding Vatican papers. Sometimes it worked, often it did not. By the summer of 1944, over 400,000 Hungarian Jews had been deported to Auschwitz, and there was nothing Rota or anyone else could do to stop it. The scale of the Holocaust had overwhelmed even the most determined rescue efforts. For every family saved, dozens more were lost, and through it all Pope Pius XII maintained his agonizing silence. His defenders point to a critical moment in 1943 when he came the closest to issuing a public condemnation. After the roundup of Jews in Rome in October of that year, Pius drafted a letter of protest to be read in all the churches of the city. The letter explicitly condemned the deportation of Jews and called on Catholics to resist. But before it could be published, Vatican officials received intelligence that the Nazis were planning to escalate. If the letter were read, they warned, the Gestapo would raid every church in Rome simultaneously. Thousands of Jews hiding in religious institutions would be captured in a single day. Pius made the decision to suppress the letter. It was never read. It was filed away in the Vatican archives, where it would remain hidden for decades. To his critics, this moment encapsulates his moral failure. He had the chance to speak, and he chose silence. To his defenders, it proves his impossible position. A public condemnation would have been a death sentence for the very people he was trying to save. What is undeniable is that the network continued to operate, and it continued to save lives, right up until the liberation of Rome in June of 1944. When American troops entered the city, they found thousands of Jews emerging from churches, convents, and monasteries, blinking in the sunlight, alive because strangers had risked everything to hide them. Some had been in hiding for months, others for over a year. They had survived on scraps of food, sleeping on cold stone floors, living in constant fear that the next knock on the door would be the Gestapo. But they had survived, and when they were finally free, many of them went directly to the Vatican to thank the Pope, who had never publicly acknowledged their existence. Pius received them privately, in small groups, and wept with them. But he still did not speak publicly about what had been done. The war was not over yet. Jews were still dying in camps across Europe, and as long as the killing continued, Pius believed that silence was the only strategy that could still save lives. When the war finally ended in May of 1945, the full scope of the Holocaust became undeniable. The camps were liberated, the gas chambers were photographed, the mass graves were excavated. 6 million Jews had been murdered, and the world reeled in horror at the scale of the atrocity. In the immediate aftermath, the Catholic Church, and Pope Pius XII specifically, were praised by Jewish leaders and organizations for the role they had played in saving lives. The chief rabbi of Rome, Israel Zolli, was so moved by the Church's actions that he converted to Catholicism and took the baptismal name Eugenio in honor of Pope Pius. Zolli publicly stated that the Church had saved more Jews than any other institution in Europe. Golda Meir, then a member of the Israeli government and later Prime Minister, sent a message of gratitude to the Vatican, acknowledging the efforts of Catholics who had risked their lives to shelter Jews. The World Jewish Congress issued a statement thanking Pius for his humanitarian efforts. For nearly 2 decades after the war, the dominant narrative was clear. The Pope had worked quietly behind the scenes to save as many people as possible, and his silence had been a strategic necessity, not a moral failure. But then, in 1963, everything changed. A German playwright named Rolf Hochhuth premiered a play in Berlin called The Deputy. The play portrayed Pope Pius XII as a cold, calculating figure who prioritized the preservation of the Church over the lives of Jews. It depicted him as indifferent to the suffering of the Holocaust, more concerned with maintaining diplomatic relations with Nazi Germany than with taking a moral stand. The play was a sensation. It sparked protests, debates, and a complete reassessment of Pius's wartime actions. Overnight, the man who had been praised as a quiet hero became vilified as the Pope of Hitler, a coward who had remained silent while millions died. The timing of the play was significant. It premiered during the Second Vatican Council, a period of intense reform within the Catholic Church, and it fed into a growing sentiment that the Church needed to reckon with its past. Hochhuth's play was not a historical document. It was a work of fiction, based on selective interpretations of the evidence, but it shaped public perception in a way that decades of scholarship could not undo. The controversy intensified in the following years as historians began digging deeper into the Vatican's wartime archives. The problem was that those archives were sealed. The Vatican has a policy of keeping its internal documents classified for 75 years after the death of a pope, and Pius had died in 1958. This meant that the most sensitive records from his papacy would not be available until the 2030s. Critics argued that the Vatican was hiding evidence of Pius's complicity. If he had truly done everything in his power to save Jews, they asked, why not open the archives and prove it? The Vatican's response was that the archives contained sensitive diplomatic correspondence that could endanger living individuals and compromise ongoing church operations. But to many, this explanation sounded like an excuse. The secrecy fueled suspicion, and the suspicion fueled the narrative that Pius had something to hide. By the 1970s and 80s, the dominant view in popular culture and academia had shifted. Pius was no longer seen as a hero. He was seen as, at best, a morally ambiguous figure, and at worst, a silent accomplice to genocide. Jewish organizations, which had once praised Pius, began to distance themselves from that earlier gratitude. The generation of survivors who had personally been saved by Catholic clergy was aging, and their voices were being drowned out by a new generation of scholars and activists who had not lived through the war and who viewed Pius's silence as inexcusable. The debate became polarized. On one side were those who argued that Pius had done everything he could within the constraints of his impossible position, that he had saved hundreds of thousands of lives through covert action, and that condemning him for not doing more was applying peacetime morality to a wartime crisis. On the other side were those who argued that moral leadership requires public condemnation of evil, that Pius's silence had given cover to Catholic populations who participated in or were complicit in the Holocaust, and that no amount of secret rescue work could excuse his failure to speak out. The truth, as always, was somewhere in the middle, but the middle ground had no champions. The story had become a battlefield. And so, for decades, the question remained unresolved. Did Pope Pius XII save 800,000 Jews, as some claimed, or was he a passive enabler of the Holocaust who did the bare minimum while millions died? The answer depended entirely on which evidence you prioritized, which testimonies you believed, and what you thought the Pope's moral obligations were in the face of absolute evil. But one thing was certain. As long as the Vatican archives remained sealed, the debate would continue. And as long as the debate continued, Pius's legacy would remain divided. He would be remembered by some as a saint who worked miracles in the shadows, and by others as a moral failure who chose institutional preservation over prophetic witness. Both narratives had evidence, both had passionate defenders, and both, in their own way, were true. Then, in March of 2020, something extraordinary happened. Pope Francis, the current pontiff, made a decision that would reignite the entire debate. He ordered the Vatican Secret Archives, now renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archives, to open all documents related to the papacy of Pius XII, a full decade earlier than required by Vatican protocol. Thousands of files, letters, telegrams, and reports that had been sealed for over 60 years were suddenly made available to scholars. It was an unprecedented move, and it came with a clear implication. Francis wanted the truth to come out, whatever that truth might be. If the archives contained evidence that Pius had been complicit in the Holocaust, so be it. If they contained evidence that he had run a massive rescue operation, that too should be known. For the first time, historians would have access to the raw, unfiltered communications from inside the Vatican during the darkest years of the 20th century. The world waited to see what they would find. The first wave of research from those newly opened archives was published in 2021 and 2022, and the findings were complex, messy, and deeply human. What emerged was not a simple story of heroism or cowardice, but a portrait of a man trapped in an impossible situation, making calculated decisions with incomplete information, trying to balance the survival of the Church with the moral imperative to save lives. The documents showed that Pius received detailed reports about the Holocaust as early as 1941, far earlier than some had believed. He knew about the ghettos, the mass shootings, the deportations. His aides wrote memos describing the atrocities in explicit detail, and yet his public statements remained vague and diplomatic. But the archives also revealed something else. They showed a pattern of covert action that was far more extensive than previously documented. Papal nuncios across Europe had been given broad authority to issue protective documents, to negotiate with local authorities, and to use Vatican funds to facilitate escapes. These actions were coordinated, deliberate, and clearly sanctioned by Pius himself, even if he never put his name on an official order. One of the most significant discoveries in the archives was a series of encrypted telegrams between Pius and his nuncio in Slovakia, Giuseppe Burzio. In 1942, Slovakia, a Nazi puppet state, began deporting its Jewish population to concentration camps. Burzio sent urgent messages to Rome, describing the deportations and begging for guidance. Pius responded with instructions to do everything possible to stop the deportations, short of provoking a complete break with the Slovak government. Burzio interpreted this as permission to act aggressively. He issued thousands of protective letters, pressured Slovak officials, and even threatened to publicly condemn the government if the deportations continued. For a brief period, the deportations slowed. Thousands of Slovakian Jews were saved because of Burzio's intervention, which he later testified was done with Pius's explicit approval. But when the deportations resumed in 1944, Burzio had no more leverage, and thousands more were sent to their deaths. The archives show that Pius agonized over this failure. He wrote in a private letter that he felt powerless, that every action he took seemed to make things worse, and that his silence haunted him daily. But the archives also contained troubling material. They revealed that Pius had been deeply concerned about the possibility of a Nazi invasion of the Vatican, and that this fear had influenced many of his decisions. In several internal memos, Vatican officials discussed the risk of provoking Hitler and debated whether a public condemnation would do more harm than good. Some of these memos suggested that Pius believed a formal statement would be symbolic and ineffective, and that quiet diplomacy was the only realistic option. But other documents showed that Pius was also worried about the post-war political landscape. He feared that if the Church alienated Germany too completely, it would lose influence in a future Europe. He worried about the spread of communism from the Soviet Union, and he saw Nazi Germany, for all its evils, as a potential bulwark against Stalin. This political calculus was deeply controversial. Critics argued that it proved Pius prioritized institutional power over moral witness. Defenders countered that every leader during the war was making similar calculations, trying to navigate a geopolitical nightmare with no good options. The most damning piece of evidence, at least for Pius's critics, was the discovery of the suppressed letter from October 1943, the one he had drafted after the roundup of Jews in Rome and then chose not to publish. The archives contained multiple drafts of the letter, each one stronger than the last, each one explicitly condemning the Nazi deportation of Jews. But attached to the final draft was a handwritten note from one of Pius's closest advisors, warning that publication would result in mass retaliation. The advisor estimated that if the letter were read in churches across Rome, the Gestapo would raid every religious institution in the city within 48 hours, and that thousands of Jews currently in hiding would be captured and killed. Pius had written in the margin of this note a single word in Latin, doleo, which translates to, "I grieve," and then he had ordered the letter buried. For his critics, this was proof that Pius had chosen caution over courage. For his defenders, it was proof that he understood the stakes better than anyone and made the only choice that could save lives. The opening of the archives also brought forward a flood of survivor testimonies that had been quietly catalogued by the Church, but never widely publicized. These testimonies, collected in the years immediately after the war, painted a vivid picture of the rescue network in action. Hundreds of Jewish survivors gave detailed accounts of how they had been saved by priests, nuns, and lay Catholics, acting under what they believed were direct orders from the Pope. One testimony came from a woman named Miriam Levy, who had been hidden in a convent in Rome with her 2 young children for 18 months. She described how the Mother Superior of the convent told her explicitly that the Pope himself had instructed all religious houses to open their doors to Jews, and that anyone who refused would be acting against the will of God. Levy and her children survived the war and emigrated to Israel, and she spent the rest of her life defending Pius's legacy, insisting that he had saved her family. But her testimony, like so many others, had been filed away in the Vatican archives, unknown to the broader public until the documents were unsealed. Another powerful testimony came from a Hungarian Jew named Tibor Baranski, who had been issued a protective letter by the papal nuncio Angelo Rota in Budapest. Baranski described how he and dozens of other Jews had been lined up for deportation when Rota himself appeared at the train station, waving Vatican documents and demanding that anyone holding a protective letter be released. The Nazi officers, confused and unsure of their authority to override a Vatican diplomat, allowed Rota to pull several dozen people off the train. Baranski was one of them. He later testified that Rota told him the letters were being issued on direct orders from Rome, and that the Pope had instructed nuncios across Europe to use any legal or diplomatic tool at their disposal to prevent deportations. Baranski survived the war, and in 1946 he traveled to Rome to meet Pius in person and thank him. He described the Pope as visibly emotional, weeping as Baranski recounted his story. But Pius never spoke about these encounters publicly. Even after the war, even when he could have used these testimonies to defend his legacy, he remained silent. The archives also revealed the extent to which the rescue operation had been funded by Vatican resources. Financial records showed that between 1942 and 1945, the Vatican had quietly transferred millions of dollars in today's currency to papal nuncios, bishops, and Catholic charitable organizations across Europe. These funds were used to bribe officials, pay for forged documents, arrange safe passage, and support the hidden refugees. Some of the money came from the Vatican's own treasury. Some came from wealthy Catholic donors who had been quietly approached by Vatican officials and asked to contribute to what was described only as humanitarian relief. There was no public accounting of these funds, no official budget line, no paper trail that could be traced back to the Pope. It was financial espionage run through the Church's diplomatic and charitable infrastructure, and it was remarkably effective. But it also meant that for decades, no one outside the Vatican knew how much money had been spent or where it had gone. Critics had long accused the Church of hoarding wealth while people suffered. The financial records suggested the opposite. The Church had spent a fortune trying to save lives, but it had done so in absolute secrecy. The testimonies and documents also highlighted the regional variations in the rescue effort. In Italy, where the Vatican had direct influence and where Catholic culture was deeply embedded, the rescue network was extensive and relatively successful. In Poland, where the Nazi occupation was brutal and where the Church itself was under severe persecution, the rescue efforts were more limited and far more dangerous. Priests in Poland who hid Jews were not just risking arrest, they were risking execution, and the Nazis made good on that threat repeatedly. In Western Europe, in countries like France and Belgium, the rescue network operated more openly because local governments, even under Nazi occupation, retained some degree of autonomy and were more susceptible to diplomatic pressure. But in Eastern Europe, where the Nazis ruled with absolute authority, the rescue efforts were desperate, improvised, and often unsuccessful. The archives made it clear that Pius's ability to influence events varied wildly depending on geography, and that the claim of 800,000 Jews saved, while potentially accurate in aggregate, masked enormous regional disparities. But perhaps the most revealing documents in the newly opened archives were Pius's private diaries and letters, written in the final years of his life. In these documents, he reflected on his wartime decisions with a mixture of pride and profound guilt. He wrote that he believed his strategy of covert action had saved more lives than a public condemnation ever could have, but he also acknowledged that he would never know for certain. He questioned whether he had done enough, whether his fear of Nazi retaliation had been justified, whether a braver man would have spoken out regardless of the consequences. In one particularly haunting entry from 1956, just 2 years before his death, he wrote that he prayed every night for the forgiveness of the Jews who had died, and that he hoped history would judge him not by his silence, but by the lives that had been saved in that silence. It was the confession of a man who had carried an unbearable burden, and who knew that no matter what the archives revealed, his legacy would forever be contested. So what is the truth? Did Pope Pius XII save 800,000 Jews, or is that number an exaggeration, a post-war myth constructed to absolve the Church of its moral failures? The honest answer is that we will probably never know the exact number. The rescue operation was designed to leave no paper trail. Families were hidden under false names. Documents were forged and backdated. Convents and monasteries did not keep ledgers of the Jews they sheltered, because doing so would have been a death sentence if discovered. After the war, researchers attempted to reconstruct the scale of the rescue effort by interviewing survivors, cross-referencing testimonies, and analyzing fragmentary records. Some estimates put the number as high as 800,000. Others suggest it was closer to 400,000. A few skeptical historians argue it may have been even lower, perhaps 200,000. But even the most conservative estimates acknowledge that the Catholic Church, operating under the direction or at least the tacit approval of Pope Pius XII, saved more Jews than any other non-governmental institution in Europe. That is not a matter of debate. What remains debated is whether that number, whatever it was, absolves Pius of the sin of silence. The argument against Pius is straightforward and emotionally powerful. He was the spiritual leader of hundreds of millions of Catholics. His voice carried moral authority that no other figure in Europe possessed. If he had issued a clear, unambiguous condemnation of the Holocaust, if he had named the Nazis and called their actions evil, it could have galvanized resistance. It could have made it harder for ordinary Catholics to participate in or ignore the genocide. It could have saved lives not just through covert action, but through public witness. The failure to speak out, his critics argue, sent a message to the world that the Church was more concerned with its own survival than with the lives of the persecuted. And even if his silence was strategic, even if it was intended to protect the rescue network, the moral cost of that silence was incalculable. Millions of Jews died while the Pope spoke in riddles and euphemisms. That is a stain that cannot be erased by testimonies of individual rescues, no matter how heroic those rescues were. The argument in favor of Pius is equally compelling, though more complex. His defenders point out that he was operating in a context of total war under a regime that had shown it would murder anyone who stood in its way. A public condemnation would not have stopped the Holocaust. Hitler did not care what the Pope thought. The Nazis had already demonstrated their willingness to ignore or suppress religious authority. In the Netherlands, when Dutch bishops issued a public letter condemning the deportation of Jews in 1942, the Nazis retaliated by rounding up and deporting all Jews who had converted to Catholicism, including the philosopher Edith Stein, who was murdered at Auschwitz. The public protest did not save lives. It cost lives. Pius knew this. He had reports from across Europe showing that public condemnations led to escalated violence. So he made the agonizing calculation that covert action, funded quietly and executed in the shadows, was the only strategy that could actually save people. And by that measure, his strategy worked. Hundreds of thousands of Jews survived because of the network he authorized and funded. That is not a myth. That is documented fact. But the debate is not really about numbers. It is about what we believe moral leadership requires in the face of absolute evil. Do we judge Pius by the results, by the lives saved through his covert network? Or do we judge him by his silence, by the public witness he failed to provide? Those are two different standards, and they lead to two different conclusions. If you believe that a leader's primary obligation is to achieve tangible results, to save as many lives as possible through whatever means necessary, then Pius succeeded. He made a cold, strategic decision to sacrifice his moral authority in order to preserve the infrastructure that could shelter refugees. He let himself be remembered as complicit, as silent, as cowardly, because that silence allowed the rescue operation to continue. But if you believe that moral leadership requires prophetic witness, that speaking truth to power is an obligation regardless of the practical consequences, then Pius failed. He chose pragmatism over principle, and in doing so, he abdicated his responsibility as the vicar of Christ. Both of these perspectives are valid. Both are rooted in deeply held moral convictions, and both are, in their own way, correct. The tragedy of Pius XII is that he was caught in a situation where there were no good choices, only less terrible ones. He could speak out and risk the destruction of the rescue network, or he could remain silent and risk being remembered as a moral coward. He chose silence, and he spent the rest of his life haunted by that choice. The archives show a man who was deeply conflicted, who second-guessed his decisions, who prayed for forgiveness and feared judgment. He was not a villain. He was not a saint. He was a human being trying to navigate an inhuman crisis, and he made decisions that saved some lives while failing to save others. History has not been kind to him, and perhaps it should not be, but history has also not been entirely fair. The full story of what he did and why he did it is more complicated than either his critics or his defenders want to admit. Today, more than 80 years after the end of World War II, the debate over Pope Pius XII continues. In 2023, new research published by a team of international historians analyzed the newly opened Vatican archives alongside testimonies from Jewish survivors and records from Nazi officials. Their conclusion was cautiously worded but significant. They estimated that the Catholic Church's rescue network, operating under the direction or authorization of Pius, was directly responsible for saving between 400,000 and 800,000 Jewish lives, with the most likely figure being somewhere around 560,000. That would make it the largest organized rescue effort of Jews during the Holocaust, surpassing even the work of Oskar Schindler, Raoul Wallenberg, and other celebrated heroes. And yet most people have never heard this story. Most people still think of Pius XII, if they think of him at all, as the Pope who stayed silent while millions died. The truth is buried in archives, scattered across testimonies, hidden in the same shadows where the rescue operation itself once operated. So why does this story matter today? Because it forces us to confront an uncomfortable question about moral leadership in times of crisis. We live in a world that values public statements, bold declarations, and visible acts of resistance. We celebrate leaders who speak truth to power, who stand on principle regardless of the cost. And those things are important. But the story of Pius XII reminds us that sometimes the most effective form of resistance is the one no one sees. Sometimes saving lives requires silence, secrecy, and the willingness to be misunderstood by history. Pius chose to be hated by future generations if it meant that families hiding in convents could survive one more day. He chose to be remembered as a coward if it meant that priests forging documents would not be discovered. That is not the kind of heroism we celebrate. It is quiet, ambiguous, and morally complicated, but it is heroism nonetheless. The Catholic Church has spent decades trying to rehabilitate Pius's image, and in 2009, Pope Benedict XVI declared him venerable, the first step toward sainthood. The process stalled amid controversy, and it remains stalled today. Jewish organizations have urged the Vatican to halt the canonization process, arguing that declaring Pius a saint would be an insult to Holocaust victims. Catholic defenders argue that sainthood is not a claim of moral perfection, but a recognition that Pius acted with extraordinary virtue in an impossible situation. The debate has become a proxy war for larger questions about the Church's role in history, about how we remember the Holocaust, and about who gets to decide what constitutes heroism. And in the middle of that debate is a man who has been dead for over 60 years, unable to defend himself, unable to explain his choices, remembered by some as a savior and by others as a symbol of moral failure. But the people who were actually saved by the Church's rescue network, the survivors and their descendants, have a different perspective. Many of them have spent their lives defending Pius, insisting that he deserves to be remembered as a hero. They have testified at Vatican hearings, written memoirs, and given interviews, all trying to tell a story that the world does not seem to want to hear. Because the story of Pius XII does not fit neatly into our moral categories, it is not a story of pure good versus pure evil. It is a story of compromise, calculation, and the grinding reality of trying to save lives in a world designed for death. It is a story that challenges our assumptions about what leadership looks like and about how we should judge people who make impossible choices under unimaginable pressure. And perhaps that is why it has been so easy to forget. The Vatican's rescue network operated in the shadows because that is where it had to operate. The 800,000 Jews, or 500,000, or whatever the real number is, they survived because strangers chose to risk everything for them without expecting recognition or reward. And at the center of that network, issuing quiet orders and praying for guidance, was a man who chose to be remembered as silent rather than risk the collapse of the only system that could save lives. That is the legacy of Pope Pius XII. Not the man who stayed silent while millions died, but the man who stayed silent so that hundreds of thousands could live. History has not yet decided which story to tell, but now at least you know both.